Hello, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll show you how I made a coastal building that's fallen victim to storms and neglect. Most importantly though, I'll show you how I surprised my players with the fact that this building is also hiding a secret, and that was only revealed to them as the narrative progressed. But let's start from the beginning. I mainly use balsa wood and XPS foam for this build. The balsa probably isn't necessary, but knowing that the backside of the building would be heavily weighted down with plaster rock and Sculptamold, I opted for more structural integrity just in case. One of the necessities for this build was to maintain 2 notional walls. I needed these rooms viewable and accessible in combat, so these 2 walls are going to be intentionally left up to the imagination. My friends and I are playing through an official D&D campaign, so I'll keep which campaign we are playing vague to avoid spoiling content. In short, this building is for a specific battle that my players will be encountering this week. There's a vampire below, and he needs their help, incentivizing them with useful information. Either way, they help him and get into a fight with some homebrew enemies, which are a group of cleric apparitions, or they decide against helping the vampire and fight him instead. The main goal of the terrain building, though, for this video anyways, is to reveal that this hidden room halfway through the session has been here the whole time, regardless of the players even seeing it on the tabletop. This has been something that I've wanted to do as kind of like a challenge to myself for a long time now. I stuck smaller pieces of balsa wood and measured them accordingly, pinned them into the larger framing of the building, and then added wood glue. This helped me get the measurements right so they were straight across from pillar to pillar. I also needed these on the insides of the pillars because this is what the removable floorboards were going to sit on. Some of the bigger beams were harder to insert pins into, so I just drilled pilot holes into them. I forgot to texture the foam before building out the framing, so I did that at this point, with a little help from Critical Role. I then scored the foam with my Ulfa knife. Widened the gap with a pen. In any difficult areas to get the scoring, which once again, probably could have done beforehand, I just used a smaller X-Acto knife. I then repeated those same steps, cutting up the lengths of the floorboards. I went back and forth on adding these last 2 frames because they're technically in the way, but I figured they're really not that in the way for gameplay reasons, and plus, they gave a little more structural integrity for these removable floorboards that I'm about to make. I cut removable pieces of chipboard to size so they fit within the second floor framing. I then measured and cut pieces of foam that were going to be the permanent walls on the back and the sides of the piece. If you look closely at the final product, it is pretty clear that this doesn't make a ton of geological sense, but hey, it's fantasy. They built a building on some rocks and someone tunneled through it. This meant that the back room and the walls that it shared needed rocks and earth on them, so I poured some water and plaster into Woodland Scenics' rock molds. While that was drying, I started making the middle wall that hides the back room. I carved the small hole that the vampire is using to navigate in and out of the room, and then scored divots into the sides of it to make it look like planks. Once the walls were in, I used the Ulfa knife to make sure that the foam and the framing were flush. The rocks were done curing now, so I started applying them with hot glue to the walls. Ordinarily, I would suggest that hot glue isn't enough to keep these on here for a very long time, but Sculptamold was next, and that was going to help keep them where they needed to be. With a lot of the planning out of the way, I could now just kind of craft how I like. After texturing and cutting the foam, I put them plank by plank on the removable bits, and then started building up the walls on the sides up high. It's really important that these walls are only connected to the framing, because you want the floor removable. This is how I sold the idea that there's nothing below. Since this isn't a modular design, and I'm really probably only going to use it once for a battle, it doesn't need to be the most strong thing in the world. I just want it to look good and to be immersive for the players. I wanted the upstairs to look like it had at least some semblance of walls, so I added a door and other planks to the removable bit. This kind of went against my rule that I went into the build having, but when I realized that if I tilted it a certain way I could remove it easily, then adding a door was a no-brainer. I cut a small strip of foam to size just to blend in the step up into the doorway area. Once again, I didn't want these players to know this was here. On the oceanside floor upstairs, I cut slivers into the chipboard in order to shine a little light through in case we didn't want to remove it in gameplay, but it was a little flimsy, so I added some framing. The benefit was this framing looked really good and kind of realistic when you looked through the floorboards. The downstairs battle area was really flat and one-dimensional, so I carved a crude design into 2 pieces of foam and then used my wire cutter to cut stairs out of it. Once the stairs were in place, I just started throwing on additional pieces of discarded wood on top of it. If you've been enjoying the video so far, don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date with what I'm doing. I used super glue and foam to build up the last permanent wall upstairs, and then went to the Mod Podge stage and got the whole project Mod Podged. Once that was dry, I took it to the airbrush and I did a zenithal highlight. While I was in this space, I used the same airbrush to add red to the vampire den. I added a little too much and I tried to tone it back, but the damage was kind of done, but it's alright. I almost entirely used really cheap acrylic paints for this build. I just used dark browns for the wood and then light browns to highlight that wood. I initially did gray and blue for the rocks, and then I ended up going over it with some umber. Once that umber dried, I just dry brushed a little highlight onto the rocks. I created some moss paste using PVA glue and flocking, and when I started putting it on the project, it just renewed the vigor for the entire build. I was ecstatic. It was like everywhere I put it on, it helped me tell a story. I put it near a hole in the floorboards to imply that maybe the vampire's been collecting his blood or bodies from fishermen in the middle of the day when they're alone, and then started putting it on rocks and kind of imagined players trying to navigate on top of the rocks and having to make different checks and saves depending on how slippery the surfaces were, and it was just a whole lot of fun, and I cannot wait to use this piece in-game. Whenever I bring a piece to my table and my players see it and they think that maybe we were going to do Theater of the Mind for this battle, and then I go to the garage and I bring out this piece and put it on the table and they all freak out, it's intoxicating. It's such a fun experience, and honestly, it's one of my favorite things to craft. I can't get enough of it, and I hope that they feel the same. I decided me packaging and making bases for these minis wasn't the most necessary thing to narrate, but I did a little bit of object source lighting with the spells the clerics were casting, and then since I wanted them kind of like an ethereal apparition, I kept the painting really simple, and I mean simple, like most of it is still white. I made a little blood for the blood god mix with UV resin and then started putting it into the little divots into the cave. This ended up kind of drying in a weird way, and I probably just should have used blood for the blood god on its own. I created a tiny little set of balsa wood chairs and a table just to give a little life to the upstairs. I made a little coffin out of foam and textured it, and then painted it brown, gave it a little bit of a light highlight afterwards. And then I just took some very light green and I barely scratched the surface of some of the thicker parts of the moss. Once that was dried, my quest is complete. Here are the final shots of the build. Thanks for watching.